Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with something a little darker, the punishments and pottage of the period of plagues. Forget the castles and chivalry that Hollywood sold you, and learn the truth about what life was like in the Middle Ages. You probably wouldn't last a day, so please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in. However, please only let me know in the comments if you truly love what I do here. What time is it for you, and where are you tuning in? It's always interesting to see who is joining us. Worldwide, now turn down the lights and perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background music, and let's take it slow as we go on our journey tonight. Congratulations, you just woke up in the good news that you're still alive in the year 1325. The terrible news are the fleas. Your bed is a mattress made of partially rotten straw that is filled with. 3 months ago, it was a barn floor, so there are bugs and hay that smell like that. There is no memory foam. Cushions, no Egyptian cotton linens at all. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been cleaned since the previous winter, and currently weighs about the same as a small cow due to the accumulation of dirt. You wake up as the church bell rings in the distance. It's like an alarm clock from the Middle Ages, only louder and somehow even less forgiving. Your house is a wooden cottage with a nice open porch and one room without windows. Concept floor plan in which household insects, animals, and your family all occupy the same area. The scent is amazing. Aromatic symphony, a delicate combination of goat sweat, stale beer, human perspiration, and scented candles are undoubtedly something you pray won't grow mold, but deep down you know it won't. Don't exist, and even if they did, they would simply melt on your dirt floor. You're 22 years old, and you instantly regret stretching because the air is chilly and your joints hurt, which, according to medieval terminology, is around middle-aged. Your knees sound like a bewildered peasant shaking a sack of rocks. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either crusty from something or moist from the rain from last night that seeps through the thatched roof. Your neighbor's chicken did in any case. You're now included in the ecology. Oh, and privacy. How about your whole family and possibly a stranger? There is no bedroom, no curtains, no alone time, just communal, and your cousin, who has never left, is waking up next to you. Greetings from medieval Europe, where you're never really alone due to parasites, rats, and you're always accompanied by 8 other people, and this is how your day begins. Congratulations, nature. It only gets worse from here. You've managed to escape your medieval haystack of horrors. Calls, and instead of being courteous, it's yelling. Here's where you begin to miss the contemporary restroom. There isn't even a slight flush, toilet paper, a seat, or a toilet. Bitter plunger in the corner in the 14th century, getting rid of oneself is If you're a peasant, your bathroom is a social experiment and frequently a tiny public event. Uncle Wolf Stan had a difficult night after eating poorly, so it's likely that the wooden bucket behind the house is already full. Turnips have a biblical odor. Hold your breath, take care of yourself, and then, now for the really exciting part, throw it into the street. Yes, the street. Before throwing it out the window, yell something like Garde à l'eau, which is Old French meaning, watch out below. To be honest, nobody ever moves quickly enough, and medieval town streets are lovely rivers of human waste that resemble open sewers. Mysterious liquids and animal droppings you don't want to look at if you're fortunate enough to reside in a town with public. Congratulations, latrines. You get to sit next to strangers in an outhouse, where ventilation is a cruel joke and privacy is a myth. You may engage in small talk, but try not to breathe too deeply. Most folks use straw leaves to wipe. I've never heard of toilet paper, rags, moss, or a piece of wool if they're feeling particularly decadent. Sometimes nothing at all, which could account for the lack of popularity of handshakes. Yet, and it's undoubtedly nicer if you're in a castle. In a way, you may have a guard robe with a waist-dropping hole in the wall. Straight into the moat, which is a great idea, but your adversaries are aware of it. Attackers have occasionally entered through the waist chute. Discuss going in through the rear entrance. Regardless of whether you're medieval, toileting is a humiliating routine for a farmer or a nobleman. It's chilly. It's one slip on a damp stone path is perilous and always disgusting for the general public. Now you're face first in the remains of humanity. You haven't brushed your teeth yet, but we'll talk about that later. You should be rewarded for making it through the toilet, perhaps with a delicious breakfast. I apologize, but this is medieval Europe. Something warm, tasty, and soothing. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a somber event, and nothing is reassuring here. There are no avocado toast, coffee makers that sputter awake, or eggs Benedict. You must sit or crouch. Welcome to your everyday routine. Next to the fire is a wooden dish filled with what appears to have been scraped off a filthy boot. Pottage is a thick, gooey stew cooked with everything you can find, such as grains, root vegetables, and sometimes a few. It has been boiling in the same pot for days or weeks, and if you're lucky, beans. New additions are simply thrown on top of the previous ones. It's more of a continuous culinary experiment than a recipe. On the side, a chunk of bread produced from coarse rye or barley flour, frequently thickened with sawdust, is so hard that it might deflect arrows. Since wheat is a rich man's dream, you can substitute ground-up acorns or other inventive ingredients to make this loaf. You bargain with it instead of slicing it, pal. What about drinks? Drinking an oat milk latte or orange juice, and you're sipping beer. Yes, alcohol at 6 a.m. Why? Because of the abundance of parasites and dirt in the water. You get your day started with weak ale, minimal alcohol, and high survival. Kids also drink it, but nobody else does. Pleased, but at least it won't kill you right away. Do you want some meat or? Only if your Lord allows it. Cheese dream on Sundays and saints' feast days. Is feeling giving the majority of peasants only sometimes consume meat during the year. Just for in-season fresh fruit that hasn't already fermented into wine and, if you're not royalty, don't even consider spices. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly salary, and salt is. You swallow your medieval beer, chew your gritted bread, and try not to think about anything that is important enough to be kept up. The rodent that might have eaten your oatmeal throughout the night doesn't give you energy. It just occurs to you, and it's time to work now that you're adequately underfed. You've eaten your depressing medieval because your life depends on it, and it really does. Breakfast, and it's time to get dressed. It won't help that you just have one outfit in your closet. For months or even years, you've been wearing a tough wool tunic or linen shift every day. There is no such thing as wearing this till it breaks down or causes a fungal infection is considered seasonal fashion. Depending on your luck, you could want to wear a linen under your tunic. If you're not feeling well, you're moving commando behind layers of wet, itchy wool that had been painstakingly sewn together by someone who most likely had no notion of how a seam should have appeared, and there isn't even a washing machine, soap, or dry cleaning in. Your clothes smell like a compost pile and are stiff and discolored. Been placed in a pigsty to marinade. Even if you wanted to wash them, it would be difficult because you would need to carry water from a well or river, heat it over a fire, and then use ashes to scrub your tunic on a board, or hang it in the sun, which is present about 3 days a year, and, not to mention shoes, if you have any, they are composed of raw leather that is hardly sewn together and serve as. Most peasants simply walk barefoot through mud with as much arch support as a banana peel, via disease puddles, sharp rocks, medieval landmines, and excrement. This indicates that your skin despises you and that you are always itching from bed bugs and fleas. They are itchy nobles monks, and they reside rent-free on your body. No one gets away when kids are strolling through insect farms, and you'll be scratching your armpit, while conversing with the local priest, using a wooden spoon, and nobody will even notice that your skin is raw from rubbing. Your scalp is a battleground for bites, and if you get a rash, it's too terrible. Without a dermatologist, hydrocortisone, or someone to warn you that it's most likely scabies, you continue to suffer. If you're fortunate enough to avoid infection, that rash will just follow you around for the next 6 months like an undesired medieval sidekick. It's time to go outside now that you're covered in agony and wearing a miserable outfit. Now that you're completely covered in itchy clothes and wet wool, it's time to flash that morning. Start pushing yourself to death. Smile, but you don't, since it was a risky game in the Middle Ages. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, and no emotional support. Floss. The idea of dental hygiene is as common as taking a bath, which is to say not very. Some people may rinse with vinegar or wine or chew on a twig, but your teeth are mostly on their own and aren't performing well by themselves. When you reach your mid-20s, your smile appears to have been lifted from a spooky crypt. Cavities are rife with gums, are swollen, and those food stains on your teeth are actually rot. Possess more dental decay than a medieval root vendor. Sugar, albeit not yet widespread, is growing more prevalent among the wealthy. Import expensive goods that are only used in little cakes or to flaunt. Wealth. If you're a nobleman, congrats. You'll ruin your teeth more quickly than The peasants will use fermented bread gradually if they are impoverished. Years of hard chewing and gritty porridge cause toothaches to become accustomed to them. They resemble the backdrop weather of the Middle Ages, the kind of agony that makes you think about praying and drinking, or using a pair of pliers to extract the tooth yourself. And that's no laughing matter. That was the dentist's true course of action. Weren't actually there, but barber surgeons, yes, the same person who cuts your hair, were. Is also extracting your murs with an iron hook, no anesthesia, and candlelight. I hope you enjoy it. Fever because, in the absence of antibiotics, it can quickly progress to sepsis and be fatal. Suffering a toothache, yes, the same problem that makes us visit a drugstore today may be your funeral in the 1300s, and social relief is also lacking. Good luck kissing halitosis foul breath is. Generally speaking, if you're single, people judge you based on your property and livestock, not on how you grin. Your teeth are now losing the war in your mouth, which is a battleground. Let's go outside since your actual job is the one that will fail. It's time to go to work, but there isn't an office, and your back is just getting started. No coffee break, no desk, and no opportunity to advance in your position if you're like 90% of. The populace is straightforward. Don't perish while working for the comfort of others. Congratulations, you are a peasant. This implies that you work the land that is owned by a lord, who most likely doesn't. You rise with the sun and only stop when it passes beyond the trees. Your tools are a wooden hoe and no weekend, no clocking out, and whatever bones remain in your body, including a rusted sickle. Sunday is off, but only if you're not working 6 days a week from sunrise to sunset, fighting off raiders, harvesting, or fervently hoping that your infected toe will stop turning. Fields are plowed by hand or, if you're black, with oxen. The labor is harsh. You dig trenches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and carry one if you're wealthy enough. Water until your spine starts to form the letter S. Nobody is interested in how you're feeling or whether you're weary. It's surprising to learn that women do more than just field work when it comes to mental health. Additionally, you take care of kids, clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and act like you. Children begin lending a hand when your husband's lice infestation doesn't gradually spread to your side of the bed. At age 5, there was no school, no toys, only a small wooden rake, and the hope that one day, not dying of the flu, and if you're among the few people who don't work as a farmer, you might be a cooper, tanner, or blacksmith. Fantastic, you still spend your days in ill-ventilated barns handling fire chemicals or animal feces. The pay is essentially periodic bleeding, breaking a bone too badly, and getting a fever drink are the benefits of survival. You can't afford to stop, even for a day, because you don't eat if you're not working, so have a warm beer and keep going. Additionally, medieval Europe had a remedy for poor eating habits, being replaced. So you clutch your shovel, disregard the blisters, and continue digging because in the Middle Ages, your work is a slow motion rather than a profession. Endurance test, since you've been working in the fields and your back is burning, let's discuss the weather because in the Middle Ages, temperature was more dependent on continuous conditions than on seasonal variations. Retribution from the sky, let's begin with winter, when there is no central heating or insulation. Just timber walls with holes you could toss a chicken through, with no weathering and heating, and covered windows. The fireplace fire is lovely an idea, but you don't have it with fabric instead of glass. Sufficient firewood to sustain it, as wood is costly and harvesting it from the wild can occasionally. It's against the law to pick up the incorrect stick from the wrong forest, and you could be put to death for it. Huddle in a moist wool tunic close to the dying embers, and use your nose to wake up. Your feet are chilly and frequently wet, and your fingers are so stiff that they feel like little medieval popsicles. Frostbite is just referred to as terrible and is not diagnosed. Good luck. Now let's go on to summer. It sounds better, doesn't it? You're at home in the summer. Becomes a clay oven with no cross breeze, fan, or deodorant at all. Although you perspire through your clothes, you are unable to take them off since exposing too much skin is scandalous and also encourages social interaction, insect bites, and sunburn. Judgment your dirty body is attracting a lot of flies, and the scent of the goat stew from the previous week is still brewing in the corner, and mosquitoes are buzzing near your ear as you. If you can sleep over the noise of your neighbors shouting and infants wailing in the fields, bakes you without a hat or sunscreen unless you made one out of straw like A. The worst thing is that you still have to deal with heat stroke, desperate scarecrow. Simply put, taking a terrible turn means that you're either shivering in your own skin or worrying if you'll be able to. Spring or your thighs are chafing into oblivion as you're perspiring through your only pair of socks. The one thing, it is constant regardless of the season. Your clothing still itch, and your food is. Welcome to climate control. Things are still awful, and your next job is still pending. There is no need to freshen up or feel thirsty in the medieval style. To wake yourself from this damp fever dream of a life too miserable in the Middle Ages, splash some water on your face. Isn't your pal attempting to kill you in secret? Let's start by having some alcohol. Like something from a fantasy film, the neighboring stream appears beautiful, bubbling, and fresh, but spoiler alert, it's not. Someone simply threw a chamber pot into it upstream, and if not that, a dead. Pigs are most likely decaying in it, along with germs, parasites, and the whole. Medieval Europe's microbial army is waiting in every drink, which is why people drank beer, yes, even kids, but before you think of what medieval kids would do. Keg stands are aware that it was a tiny beer with a low alcohol content, but a high survival rate. In order to make the water safer than whatever ran through the town canal, brewing boiled it. Wine was an additional choice if you were wealthy enough to pay for it and didn't care about getting things done before noon. What about? In theory, bathing undoubtedly involved the use of water for cleaning. In reality, however, not at all. In those days, people thought that taking a bath truly opened your pores and allowed the illness to enter. That's correct. Washing oneself was regarded as dangerous from a medical standpoint. You were cleaner. Evidently, communal baths did exist if you never removed the protective coating of dirt that was adhered to your skin, but they soon became known as hotspots for rumors, scandals, and occasionally outright medieval behavior. Naturally, the church became involved in extracurricular activities and closed many of them, even if it took a lot of work to bathe. You would have to get water from the well, boil it over a fire, and fill a. Hopefully, no one else in the house used the leaking wooden tub before you, or worse, and rainwater accumulated. In open barrels where moss grows, insects breed, and birds poop. It sounds cool. Whether it's getting on your crops or in your mouth, doesn't it make sense? In the Middle Ages, drinking water was more of a risk than a necessity. One bad swallow, and you're wasting your last days of sweating on a straw bed, holding your stomach, and thinking about all the decisions you have made in life the next time you take a sip. Pour a glass of tap water for our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of safe hydration, so they drank the water, or perhaps you simply stubbed your toe on a rock-shaped object. Like disappointment in any case, you're ill and require medical attention. Unfortunately, you live in the Middle Ages, when medicine was really simply a theological form of polite torture. Let's begin with the diagnostic. Is there anything wrong with you? Your humors are the source of your cough, rash, shattered bone, or creeping illness. The four humors, blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were out of balance. Medieval science holds that maintaining their equilibrium, like an internal soup, is essential to your health. Having a fever and a lot of blood? The solution is bloodletting. Let's drain your life force into a bowl with a hungry leech or a dull blade. And yes, barbers were frequently the ones who did it. 2 for 1 baby. Getting a haircut and having hemoglobin extracted in the same session, feeling depressed, or there is obviously too much black bile there. Laxatives may help. Prayers and a cold compress, or a warm herbal purge, while everyone avoids eye contact and begins cutting your coffin. Now, you're in serious trouble if you break a bone or sustain a terrible cut. Unless you count fainting from agony, there is no anesthesia. Surgery is performed. Using unclean knives from the Crusades, tools are heated over fire, not to sterilize them, but because they simply appear more menacing in that manner. Antibiotics, millennia-distant germ theory. Not been created. They believe that illness results from irritated God or contaminated air. Your wicked thoughts must have been the cause of your stomach ache, given your moral faults. I hope you feel comfortable confessing while throwing up. If your condition worsens, you may receive further leeches as treatment. A priest at your bedside, providing last rites in case, and crushed bugs. They are currently getting ready for the cure known as death. And if you are somehow able to recover, everyone just. Therefore, in the Middle Ages, the doctor takes all credit and the leech gets promoted, assuming that God felt sorry for you. After a long day of labor, lice, and leeches, medicine is more about surviving than it is about mending. When it is finally time to eat, you return to your Havel's stomach, growling, and get ready for the one last pleasure, a hot supper. The bad news is that your food is most likely attempting to kill you. Let's start with the fundamentals. There is no such thing as food preservation. Without a refrigerator or freezer, there is only salt smoke and the hope that the winter air will stay. Items fresh if you're fortunate enough to have some meat it has been hanging for. Days in which flies were marinated in dubious brine and perhaps shared. The mainstay of the medieval diet is bread, but with a few rat eats. In years with poor harvests, desperate peasants bolster it with. To help it stretch, add bark, sawdust, or even clay. If rice season is upon us, there's a. The ergot is a fungus that can produce hallucinations, convulsions, and occasionally. Death is similar to consuming bread tainted with tetanus and LSD. Only eat vegetables if they're in. Turnips, which are usually in season. There are a lot of boiled turnips. As you recall from Chapter 3, crushed or floating in pottage is essentially. Fruit might be a heated swamp of unknown components that has been simmering since the burial of your great-grandfather. Be accessible in the fall, but sugar is rare, costly, and it rots quickly. Dairy is another risk that the wealthy hoard to flaunt their grizzled teeth. Even if butter and cheese are better, but contain a lot of bacteria, people still eat them even when fresh milk degrades in a matter of hours. Sincerely, it's either that or chew your boodle leather. Now, let's discuss seasoning using spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg is more valuable than gold because onions give the typical peasant flavor. Most meals taste like wet burlap dusted with salt, if you're lucky, and agony. Sadly, food poses a political as well as health risk to game animals. Belong to the Lord, and if you are caught poaching a rabbit, you risk being fined, sent in jail, or possibly put to death. You could be hanged for your dinner, so when you eat your dark stew in the flickering firelight, keep in mind every. In the Middle Ages, food didn't nourish. Instead, it tested you, so even if biting is risky, you eat. It's now evening. You may believe that the day is coming to an end after working, suffering, and barely digesting your dubious stew, but don't. Relax too much because God, the priest, and your neighbor are all watching. If you miss Mass, Agnes will definitely tell on you. In medieval Europe, religion isn't simply a portion of life. It is life. The church governs your laws, your calendar, and your. If you are able to read your birth, marriage, death, and all of the stages in between, then education. Consider it your spiritual landlord, and you're constantly behind on your rent. Prayer bells are the focal point of the day. The town church bell tolls in the morning, noon, and evening, not because people require reminders, but since it is sinful to skip prayer, forget to bow. Sin in that one dream. Think about your neighbor's wife. Sin eat meat on Fridays. Double sin, and sure, priests portray damnation as being really real. Pitchfork-wielding demons, rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, and you can't read the Bible yourself, so if the epidemic doesn't frighten you, eternal damnation will. Because Latin, a language only spoken by monks and clergy, is used to write it, and that one. You depend on the religion to explain everything to you, so if the noble youngster is too nice for dirt. The reason for your crop failure, according to the priest, is that you didn't pray hard enough. Tithes should be paid on the 10th of. You must have whatever you possess. If you cultivate wheat, you must provide wheat. If you raise. If you have nothing, great. You're spiritually good. Bankrupt and doomed financially holidays are sacred days, and there are many of them. Attending mass fasting is not for fun, even when they provide breaks from work. Admitting faults and reminding yourself that happiness is a risky luxury. Heretics are burned and witches are drowned for questioning the religion. Skeptics are swiftly converted and blasphemers are beaten, so you go through the gestures, you bow, you recite, you ask your soul to endure this. If you are liked by the priest, your dirt-covered life may ultimately land in paradise. Because while God could have shown mercy during the Middle Ages, the church did not. If you thought life as a medieval peasant was difficult, imagine the dirt, starvation, and fear of childbirth experienced as a woman. Being a woman in the Middle Ages meant being socially invisible and subservient, having no health potions, no restart button, and being in hard mode since birth. The course of a girl's life is essentially set in stone. Marry young, bore children, and serve your. Education is unlikely unless you come from a noble family and your husband dies of exhaustion. When you are put to a convent, you cease developing intellectually around the time you learn how to make butter and fix a. Being engaged is not strange. Tunic marriage occurs very early. It's not about love, it's about land, animals, and being pregnant at the age of 14. Partnerships once you're married, you're really your husband's, thus your viewpoint is not necessary. Your responsibility is to maintain the house, provide food and air for everyone, and avoid complaining since it could lead to you being labeled a naysayer or worse, a witch. Depending on local fashion, such designation includes a free drowning or burning. Childbirth is a deadly lottery. There is no anesthesia, no sterile equipment, and no prenatal care. Despite midwives' best efforts, even slight issues might result in the mother or child's death. Don't panic, though. Some women survive 10 pregnancies while many do not. Your workload rises once the baby leaves. Now you have a screaming baby in a hut full of lice, and you're supposed to. You never get a break. You are the nurse who cooks, cleans, and yet helps in the fields. Break for everyone else. You're suspicious if you're single. Women who didn't fit and were vulnerable if they were widowed and outspoken were charged with witchcraft, particularly if they knew herbal remedies, had a strong personality, or even glanced at someone. Funny on a wet Tuesday, nuns lived, even though your function in the church is limited. Stringent guidelines, no free speech without authorization, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual value is consistently ranked lower than men's. To put it briefly, if you're a woman you are supposed to endure, obey, procreate, and suffer in quiet during the Middle Ages. Ideally with a smile on your face, as even during a period of widespread hardship, ladies were. You've already fought filth famine, so you were somehow expected to endure gracefully. Just when you think your day can't get any worse, there's violence loud, along with social injustice and maybe a goat. Brutal and, by medieval standards, frequently perfectly acceptable. Let's be clear, the concept of law and order mostly meant hope during the turbulent Middle Ages. The local lord isn't unhappy. There is violence in every home and on the streets. Common penalty for crimes committed on the battlefield, in religious disputes, and occasionally in queue at the communal bread oven is. More than protection, brutality and justice are performance arts. If you steal a loaf of bread, you could get pierced if you are accused of lying, or you could lose a hand if you engage in excessive gossip. Let's imagine you are wearing a metal mask that is strapped to your head and has a bar in your mouth for correction. You are being tortured to prove your innocence after being charged with a terrible crime, such as heresy, thievery, or witchcraft. Welcome to the trial by ordeal, of course. In one variation, you put your hand in the hot water. Soak a stone with water. If it recovers without infection in 3 days, you are innocent. If not, you are guilty. Option: you are thrown into a river. If you sink, you are likely dead and innocent. You will be punished regardless of your fault if you float. It's like a medieval game show where the host actively opposes you and the prize is survival, and if you receive a death sentence. It's a public event, and executions take place in front of applauding spectators. The medieval era is marked by hangings, beheadings, burnings, and occasionally the bringing of food. Equivalent of cable TV. Husbands were permitted to engage in entirely typical domestic violence. Street fights are rampant, and they are even expected to chastise their spouses and kids. War is constantly simmering. Local feuds are territorial, and you could be beaten simply by glancing at a nobleman's horse in the wrong direction. Disputes, religious crusades in the name of honoring God, or simply being bored. Someone is constantly marching off to stab someone else. Medieval society isn't broken by violence. Its society as a whole lives with the ongoing awareness that justice is capricious, life is brittle, and your neighbor could beat you up. Over a pig, therefore go with caution, keep your head down, and never put your trust in someone who has a club. You've survived the lice, leeches, and pain of not having a job, and the imminent risk of public humiliation, but now comes the last. Most medieval people die young and unglamorously if they are still alive. And still alive after turning 40, you're essentially a celebrity. You may even be called the Old One, which is more of a statistical wonder than a moniker. Let's examine it, the average. The average life expectancy is between 30 and 40 years, although neonatal mortality significantly reduces that amount. Mortality before the age of 5, about half of all children passed away. Malnutrition or a harsh winter were the only causes. There were no vaccinations, medications. I hope that if you made it through childhood, you've already reached adulthood and are worn out from work. Started as soon as you were able to stand up, and by the time you were 25, your joints were creaking like a monastery door. You might be missing a few teeth, a finger, and the majority of your initial hope. Women confronted a One of the main reasons of mortality for medieval women was particularly lethal gauntlet delivery, which provided no pain relief. Prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand. No medical intervention. While you were bleeding out on a cot filled with straw, the risks were different for men. Yet just as persistent farming mishaps, infections from minor injuries, a neighbor's intoxicated. Anger is a sidetracked crusade. It could even be dangerous to stroll to the market if you happened upon a disgruntled tax collector or a bored robber. Death may also strike silently from the plague, which caused hunger that might continue for years or overnight, turning cities into cemeteries. Seasons that cause entire communities to disappear, or from misfortunes like eating tainted grain, and shouting at the walls while having hallucinations in your last hours. And if you had a funeral, you were fortunate. Often, bodies were buried swiftly too. A hole with a few whispers, no gleaming coffins, no embalming, and no sickness. Prayers and a small amount of dirt, if there was still enough in the churchyard. Therefore, it is true that life was harsh, brief, and under continual. You didn't retire. You simply ceased being under siege by death in all its casual manifestations. Arriving. Speaking of departures, let's proceed to your last chapter. Medieval dream died. How is your day going? You woke up feeling relieved and covered in dirt. Yourself into a bucket, washed your teeth, and worked until your hunger was almost too much to bear. Spine prayed to avoid contracting the disease, scraped your way through itchy wool, screamed out for mercy, and narrowly avoided a public execution for squirrel ownership. Welcome to a day in medieval Europe that you're still dreaming about. Becoming a knight. Rethink that idealized portrayal of the heroics of the Middle Ages. Swordsmen, noble women, towers, valiant conflicts, and candlelit feasts. Halls. It's a notion that has been cultivated by fantasy literature and fairy tales, yet in reality in the harsh, violent, and incredibly unjust medieval society, hierarchy was crucial. If you were born rich, you remained rich. If you were born poor, you remained poor. Congrats. You had a higher chance of survival, but you were still at risk of a quick decision and disagreement. Burying the drafty stone of castles did not spare even the aristocrats from suffering. Flea-smoking refrigerators and politically motivated unions. Sure, you had a fur robe and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% risk of passing away from an infection or during a battle. Splinter. The simpler times weren't precisely easy, but they were. Unrelenting. Everything was more painful, everything took longer, everything came from. There were repercussions from giving birth to chewing. Life was about surviving, not leisure. And if you were able to find a moment of peace to reflect, dream, or daydream, anything better, but you couldn't do much with it. No opportunities for upward advancement. You lived with this strange rash, worked on it, and died within 10 miles, but contemporary medicine doesn't have the internet to Google it. Radius of your birthplace. But here's the crazy part. Despite everything, people continued to sing and laugh. Stories found meaning and fell in love. Not because life was simple, but because even in their darkest moments, people can be stubborn. Room for light. So when you get into your fresh bed tonight with antibiotics for indoor plumbing and perhaps express your gratitude to the modern world and to your central heating system. Forefathers who battled against feudalism, starvation, and rats so you wouldn't have. She was the mistress of Catherine, the great empress of all Russia, for a long time. Change and a symbol of aspiration. She was just Sophie Federica Augusta von. In 1729, Anhälterst was born to a little-known German aristocratic family. Family in Pomerania, her small douche had little authority yet. Sophie herself has a sharp intelligence that no title could match. Unrelenting charm and a silent, raging desire for grandeur her childhood was. Stern. Her mother Johanna was not a loving, caring person. Rather, she was calculated and frigid. However, a status-obsessed social climber, Sophie's father, a Prussian officer, was more aloof then. Disciplined from an early age, Sophie learned to balance obedience and slyness. She read, spoke several languages well, and acquired the ability to observe a space before speaking in it, which would shortly become means of survival in one of the cruelest courts in Europe when the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrona started looking outside of Russia for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter. He was of German heritage, and Empress Elizabeth thought a foreign spouse who was appreciative and supple would be. Sophie was easier to manage, and was a perfect fit for the noble blood Lutheran faith. Be compelled to give up, and a reputation for dignity and modesty at the age of 14, Sophie was. When she was called to Russia, she wore flimsy German textiles and a. Sophie's mother shoved her forward like a chess piece with a tactful smile, but had her own strategy in mind to fit in with Russian society, so she adopted the name Ekaterina Alexa after converting to Orthodoxy. Catherine was not present for the public symbolic ceremony that changed her life. She was burning the bridge behind her as she entered a foreign empire with no way out and no one to return to, simply switching religions. The next betrayal revolution might have been foreseen by observing that reserved adolescent girl wearing a fur-trimmed coat. Empire and enlightenment. But as soon as Sophie entered the Russian court, she ceased being porn and started preparing for Catherine's marriage to the Grand Duke in order to become a queen. Although Peter was supposed to guarantee her position as a member of Russian nobility, it felt more like a prison than. The charming prince of fairy tales was not the heir apparent to the Russian throne. Peter. Stories uncomfortably immature and fixated on toy troops, he was far more interested in. In his chambers playing war games rather than running an empire or expressing love to his new bride, according to some reports. Even imply that he worshipped Frederick and refused to consummate the marriage for years. The Great of Prussia and was angry with the Russian court for adopting him. Catherine, on the other hand, welcomed Russia with a strong will to study the language, research its background, and commit it to memory. She wanted to fit in, and Peter wanted to get away from this mismatch. Was political as well as emotional, and the Russian court was a haven of brutal power struggles, suspicion, and gossip. Empress Elizabeth continued to govern with total control, but her health was deteriorating, and everyone knew a change was imminent. And everyone had a goal. Catherine was continuously observed, and her correspondence was read. She couldn't be trusted since her friendships were tracked, and her every action was examined. Her mother and husband continued to whisper in her ear about foreign interests, or even her servants in this society. Partnerships may quickly devolve into accusations, but Catherine knew how to play the court's games and was not a fool. She developed supporters in secret. Charmed military commanders became acquainted with academics and gained a reputation for being dignified and disciplined. In contrast to her husband's immature outbursts and overt disrespect for Russian customs, Catherine started reading enlightened authors like Montesquieu and Voltaire. Although some perceived her as a youthful consort, she was establishing a vision for Russia as a powerful nation, not just for herself. Reason and education, but there was a catch. Catherine lived longer than Peter did. Waited and watched in limbo, a helpless wife to a man unworthy to reign. And prepared, understanding that the Russian throne would not be passed down through the generations, but would need to be seized in 1762, after almost two. After decades of silently navigating and observing, Catherine finally spotted her moment and, with amazing accuracy, he grabbed it. Empress Elizabeth had passed away, and Peter now. At last, Peter III became Tsar, but his rule nearly fell apart. In a matter of months, Peter angered the church and alienated the soldiers, was humiliated by nobles, who also showered Russia's long-standing enemies. He publicly discussed, ridiculed the clergy, and revoked important policies. The court, which was already suspicious of his unpredictable conduct, became icy when he discussed divorcing Catherine to wed his mistress. The army, packed with Catherine-loyal generals complaining in the hallways, even regular, devout and patriotic Russians viewed Peter as an outsider who made fun of their customs. Catherine, after witnessing all of this, decided to take action in July of. Catherine staged a bloodless attack that same year while Peter was away at his vacation palace. With the help of important military figures, such as her lover Gregory Olaf and his powerful brothers, she was crowned Empress. Catherine II rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia and gained the loyalty of the Peter, a formidable imperial guard, was taken by surprise and gave up without any allies. He was arrested in a matter of days and discovered dead under. Unofficially, it was described as a hemorrhoidal colic under strange circumstances. After her murder, Catherine became empress, not by birth or marriage, but by her own volition. And boldness it was uncommon for a lady who was born outside of the country to. No rightful claim had seized the Russian throne without engaging in combat, but her actual obstacle was simply. Initially, she needed to turn her audacious attempt at power into a lasting legacy. Would she be accepted in Russia, respected by the nobles, and able to keep the empire intact without being overthrown? Catherine saw that power acquired via intrigue could be lost, and she met the same end as her husband. She needed to govern as a visionary rather than a cunning person, and hence, started the process of changing from a cautious plotter to a reforming empress one. She would reinvent what it meant to be a woman in power, redraw borders, and embrace enlightenment after Catherine. She could have relied on her authority if she held the crown, but instead she had. She had more in mind than just occupying a position of power. She aimed to change Russia in ways other than military ones, or intellectually but politically. Whereas Peter had idolized toy troops and Frederick the Great, Catherine held Voltaire Didot and the audacious enlightened philosophers in high regard. She supported education, reason, and the monarch's function as a. Despite having total power herself, Catherine was a servant of the people and did more than just read. She lived under the enlightened philosophy and had direct connection with Voltaire. She invited Didot to defend her despotism while charming him for more than 15 years. To her court, and even bought his whole library to help him out financially. In private, she examined legal documents, discussed improvements, and developed policies to bring the Russian law codification was a major focus in her early rule. She established the Legislative Commission began an ambitious undertaking in 1767 with the goal of revising Russia's entire legal code. Catherine's own directives were actually a covert political agenda, one that discussed the risks of torture, equality under the law, and the duty of leaders to serve the common good was extreme for a Russian empress in the 18th century, yet, in the huge, feudal Russia of today, enlightened values had to endure. Catherine was aware that the conservative land was dominated by nobility who enjoyed surfing precisely where they were below them. Although she supported reform, she took caution. She outlawed some types of torture and increased access to secular. She constructed libraries and schools and promoted education, but she also confirmed the aristocracy's authority over there. Catherine's balancing act was to keep people faithful. She was a philosopher queen in. In private, she walked a tightrope between ideology and practicality, and surviving between Paris's glitzy salons and the grim politics of Moscow. Although she had a strong but always strategic vision for Russia, Catherine wasn't. She was attempting to modernize Russia according to her own standards, which meant, yes, reform, but Catherine wasn't satisfied with it because it was done with a velvet glove and an iron hand. Rebuilding Russia from the inside out in order to make it an empire deserving of respect, dread, and envy. Catherine sought to reach the West where Peter the Great had opened a window. Destroy the walls, she fought wars and made Russia's borders wider than they had ever been. Not only to protect her throne, but also to alter the European map. One of her most important campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire during the 1760s and 1770s. These conflicts were waged in waves, were about influence rather than just land, and Catherine viewed herself as the legitimate guardian of Eastern Europe and the liberator of Orthodox Christians suffering under Muslim domination. Russia seized important territories under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Pumpkin. Crimea, the Black Sea's northern shore, and the availability of warm water ports are some of the areas where Russian czars had long desired, and these triumphs weren't merely military, they were symbolic. Catherine conveyed the idea that Russia was no longer the faraway country with each conquest. She also turned her backward European relative into a continental force. Look westward. Through a number of agreements and shrewd moves, Catherine took part in the division of Poland, dividing the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was struggling, and by the end of the Third Division in 1795, Austria and Prussia had removed Poland from the map, and Russia claimed millions of new subjects and enormous new territories. But Catherine did more than just use armies to conquer. She also colonized with concepts. New cities were constructed, German trade routes were extended, Russian soil was opened to immigrants, and the empire was transformed into a mosaic from the frozen. From the Baltic to the Black Sea's sun-kissed beaches, Catherine remained in charge, personally giving orders, reading reports, and directing the development of her growing empire. She was criticized for being power-hungry, even imperialist, but for Catherine, growth was fate rather than aspiration. She intended to reshape Russia, not merely rule it, because she felt that a ruler was defined by more than just ideals. It is seen by its peers as a civilized empire that is devoted and feared by its adversaries. Catherine the Great was well known for what transpired behind the palace, despite her immense intelligence and strength. Doors, and no, Catherine's private life was not entirely discussed in whispers in libraries. It became one of her reign's most talked-about features. She had more than one or two boyfriends, but a well-planned parade of them that is frequently attractive and several decades younger. Politically powerful at times, she didn't conceal them. In fact, she frequently gave them pensions, estates, and titles if they behaved properly. If not, the most significant of these lovers were gently discarded, occasionally with a kind thank you and a promotion. Their relationship became hazy. Was Gregory Pumpkin a man as daring and bright as he was? The distinctions between partnership and romance politics, some historians think that, might have even secretly wed, and together they influenced military operations. Projects involving colonization and the change of southern Russia. Pumpkin was not only her lover, he was also her co-ruler in many respects, but Europe was unable to look. After the affair, she was portrayed in satirical pamphlets and gossip as passionate, ravenous, and even insane, and the tales only grew after her passing. Worse, her detractors spread a ludicrous and wholly untrue story about a horse, which is the most notorious, to disparage her heritage. But why the fixation only because Catherine was a woman, who exercised power without apology, and in a society where female leaders were supposed to be either sad characters or pious virgins, but she declined to play the role. She reigned on her own terms, lived with love, and that made her hazardous. Ironically, Catherine herself was portrayed as immoral by her detractors, had a profoundly philosophical view of sexuality and love, considering pleasure to be a normal aspect of life, and that interpersonal connections didn't have to jeopardize public accountability. She kept emotion apart from power, something that few male leaders were able to accomplish. In actuality, her relationships were. She surrounded herself with devoted, skilled, and strategic personnel, politically beneficial, and when they stopped being, she typically let them go with a grin and a comfortable retirement. Catherine's romantic life did not make her less resilient. She used a combination of power and passion to make herself a memorable figure that everyone feared and envied. Catherine's reign was not without danger due to her charisma and authority, and in 1773, that danger materialized as Ilan Pugachev, a bearded Cossack. He was Pugachev, an average rebel, claimed to be the deceased husband of Peter III. Catherine. He said he had. It seemed ridiculous that Peter had survived the coup and now returned to take back the crown from the German usurper. Gone, but to Russia's downtrodden and weary lower classes, the assertion only needed to provide. Pugachev promised freedom, an end to slavery, reduced taxes, and land for the ordinary people. His remarks stoked a fire throughout the Vile River area, particularly among the elderly and peasants of Ksak, believers during a period when the divide between serfers and nobility had ruthlessly grown. The Pugachev movement turned into the biggest peasant uprising in Russian history because his promises seemed like deliverance. Throughout history, towns were captured, strongholds collapsed, and lords were killed for a horrifying. Catherine was shaken at the moment when it appeared as though the empire itself would fall apart. It was an uprising from inside her own people, not a foreign conflict that she could vanquish with cavalry and treaties. Despite ruling against the system, Catherine remained calm and took action. Sent expert military troops to brutally put an end to the uprising. Pugachev's soldiers were defeated in 1774. He was taken prisoner, put on display in an iron cage, and then decapitated in Moscow. After issuing a loud warning to anyone who ventured to follow, Catherine stepped up her efforts to maintain order and authority over her dreams of quietly releasing the serfs. The uprising had revealed to her the boundaries of national illumination. She was still bound by feudalism and now depended more on the nobility, who promised allegiance in return for complete. This marked a sea change for the empress, who earlier had authority over their serfs. Reform became cautious, and Voltaire now put stability over philosophy. Increased surveillance revealed that the rebellion was to be crushed before. Pugachev may have lost his skull, but he never forgot to leave a warning that Catherine was troubled by the idea that a system of power based on inequity could only last so long before it collapsed. Catherine the Great had ruled Russia for more than 3 decades by the time she was nearing the end of her life. Decades longer than any Russian woman ruler in history, starting from the time she took over. She had changed her empire, defied expectations, and reinterpreted what a woman and a king might be. During Catherine's rule, Russia turned into a real powerhouse in Europe, with a geographical expansion of more than 200,000 square miles. These wins weren't simply military ones. They were also consuming Crimea, portions of Poland, and the Black Sea coast. They were crucial junctures that reshaped trade and secured warm water ports. But Catherine left a cultural effect that extended beyond her legacy on maps. She contributed to the founding of the Hermitage Museum, accumulated one of Europe's largest art collections, and communicated. Her court developed into a hub of sophisticated art and intellectual thought thanks to the best thinkers of the Enlightenment. Aspirations in a nation that Western Europeans frequently perceive as being backward. Catherine established Russia as a major cultural player by modernizing education. She encouraged the publishing of literature and established schools for girls. She also brought the smallpox vaccine to Russia. In her day, publicly obtaining the vaccine herself was a courageous scientific move. Despite her admiration for enlightened values, her rule was nonetheless marked by paradoxes, since she never released the. She actually expanded serfdom further into Russian territory through her reforms. Although impressive, it was primarily top-down and intended to refine the empire without actually changing its foundations. Even so, Catherine's reign brought ambition and stability because she recognized that power was not inherited. Rather, it was created, overseen, and continuously protected by her. Divine right, but through willpower, political savvy, and unrelenting computation, she was referred to as a seductress, a reformer, a dictator, and a user. Above all, though, she was successful. By the time of her death in 1796, Russia was larger and wealthier, more powerful than it had been for generations. She left behind a legend, an expanding kingdom, and a throne that was secure. It would last for generations. Catherine accomplished more than merely dominate. Using her intelligence, strategy, and unreserved grasp of history, she became more. Despite her power, growth, and longevity, she became a myth rather than an empress. Catherine the Great was fundamentally a woman negotiating a man's behind the royal pictures and changing the world in her image. She was not born Russian, but she was well aware of how vulnerable her position was, so she came to the throne through a coup, ruling an empire that discouraged women in leadership roles. Despite this, she not only survived, flourished. Catherine was never satisfied with being decorative. She read and wrote all the time. She never stopped learning and had a rigorous daily schedule that included hours of reading information from foreign governments, revising official documents, and overseeing a court full of conflicting factions. She didn't just sit on the throne, she worked it. In many respects, she was lonely, but she was also like a stateswoman bred to it. She described in her memoirs how few people she could really trust, despite surrounding herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists. Her son, she mistrusted Paul and avoided him in state affairs, but he developed into a man she worried would reverse all of her gains. Strongest friendship with Gregory Pumpkin dissolved into a close bond, but his passing in 1791 left a. Catherine deliberately sculpted her image to reflect a wound that never entirely healed. She pretended to be the mother of Russia and was more adept at using story than most monarchs of her era. Warrior empress, art enthusiast, and enlightened monarch, yet behind all of those titles was a woman who had suffered rejection, treachery, disgrace, and disobedience and continued to. As she passed away in 1796, she left behind a kingdom that had changed, but also, if she had been enlightened, would she have done more to put an end to slavery? She was more of a reformer or ruler, but politics tainted her, and history knows her by that moniker. She never praised herself, and it wasn't because she was perfect, nice, or just. Because in an era and location where women weren't supposed to have any power, she assumed it and used it as she saw fit. Did more than simply don the crown. She redefined what it meant to be deserving. In the damp interior of southern Mexico's Chiapas jungle, the remains of stories from the old Maya civilization are whispered by palanque, and towering temples rise above the canopy, which is still full of secrets despite the erosion of its limestone faces throughout time. And one of those secrets came to light in 1994, a group of Mexican. Temple 3 was being surveyed by archaeologists under the direction of Fanny Lopez Jimenez. Rather little pyramid adjacent to the more well-known Temple of the Inscriptions, which is the final resting place of the powerful monarch PL. Before they spotted something, they didn't think the huge temple's seat would hold much. Strangely, there was a sealed underground area underneath the building that had not been harmed by looters. Was immaculate. The researchers discovered a stone sarcophagus when they broke through and descended inside. Silently sleeping, the weight of millennia weighed heavily on the air as they. When the lid was opened, a vivid, stunning crimson dust rose like smoke. Powdered cinnabar, a hazardous mercury sulfide, was utilized to cover the inside, ceremonially by the mirror, and the skeleton of a woman who had been buried was found inside that red cloud. Her cranium remained intact despite the fragility of her bones, which were handled with respect and care. Clad in a jade mask, with necklaces of ceremonial offerings surrounding her body, ear spools and diadems made of shell and jade. The tomb exuded royalty in every way, but there was no name engraved. She was identified by glyphs, and although her grave was among the wealthiest ever discovered in Mesoamerica, it was a complete. Who was she? Was she a queen or a priestess? Why was she buried in red powder? Or possibly Pal's spouse, whom the researchers dubbed the Red Queen? And the name remained, but even with contemporary forensics, they were only able to determine that she had resided in the area. Her mausoleum, which was built during Palenque's golden age in the 7th century, had been concealed undisturbed, and deliberately sequestered her funeral wasn't merely. It was mystical and ritualistic. Words weren't meant to describe this woman. She was intended to be remembered through color, ritual, and the enigma she left behind. The Red Queen's jade jewelry wasn't the most eerie aspect of her tomb, or the quiet of the enclosed space. It was the crimson dust a heavy coating of. Everything was covered in powdered cinnabar, including the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, and even the. It was no coincidence that the offerings surrounding her stuck to the mayor like blood to stone. One of the most revered and hazardous materials in ancient times was cinnabar, which was manufactured from crushed mercury sulfide. Its vivid red hue represented blood, and was more than just a dramatic visual element. Red was revered as the color of rebirth and the life energy that united the worlds of the holy and the human, symbolizing the dawn of life sacrifice rising from the grave. And it wasn't merely symbolic. In cinnabar, covering the deceased was a spiritual practice intended to change the body, keeping it for transition rather than eternity. In Maya belief, death wasn't. In the end, it was a transition into a different layer of the cosmos, and thus the red. Whoever the queen was, she was being readied not only for burial, but also for deification. But cinnabar also has a poisonous layer that is exposed repeatedly, can result in tremors, hallucinations, and even death from mercury poisoning. The mayor probably felt its strength despite not understanding the chemistry. It was volatile, strong, and dangerous. In Palenque, relatively few people were buried. Therefore, to bathe the corpse in it was to indicate that the individual was not an ordinary mortal. The site is dominated by the pyramid of Cinnabar Pal, the great and powerful ruler. Was one, and the red powder covered his body just as it did hers. Sparked conjecture on its own. Was the Red Queen his mother, his wife, or someone comparable? Her skull had been positioned on a layer of jaguar hide, another sacred object, signifying her heavenly status. Signs surrounded by tiny jade figures, obsidian knives, and needles, suggested customs carried out in her honor at death, or during her lifetime. Every aspect of her funeral had a backstory. Without words, a secretive tale of power, a woman ready to cross into the underworld. Not in quiet, but in a ritual bathed in the hue of sacrifice. A realm of silence, broken only by the glint of jade, surrounded the Red Queen's crimson-soaked remains. Obsidian and shell were not only decorations, they were thoughtful offerings, selected to travel with her to the Xibalba, the Maya afterlife. Jade necklaces hung at her sides, their polished surfaces still chilly and weighty. Jade was more than just gorgeous after being buried for 300 years. The Maya revered it and saw it as a representation of perpetual life. Only the elite were interred with the green of the maize, the life of the jungle, and the breath of the gods. The Red Queen's jade covered her ears, wrists, and chest, indicating that, one of the most eerie items in existence, she possessed power and possibly even heavenly favor. In contrast to the Golden Death, the Jadiriri mask was softly draped over her face. Egyptian masks. This one was subtly made from dozens of little mosaics. Tiles placed to resemble her skulls features the mask was used during a ceremonial. Served to safeguard the soul, maintain individuality, and portray her as divine in. The god's eyes, bone needles, and obsidian swords were scattered around her bones. And shell artifacts, these might have been religious implements or representations of her. Rank as a royal matriarch or priestess healer, one bone pin was carved. She spoke in a little, deliberate echo that was lost to time at her feet and along. Ceramic jars that were still sealed after being filled were found around the tomb's edges, offering food, beverages, or incense to keep her soul alive after death. According to Mayer, the afterlife was a perilous and difficult journey. These things weren't luxury items. They were essential to updating the tomb, so that it feels personal rather than cluttered and deliberate. There was only spiritually significant stuff, no gold, no chariots, and no pomp. Through these artifacts, we may see how the mayor viewed death as a journey rather than a conclusion. A change of leadership, the Red Queen wasn't laid to rest to be forgotten, but rather, despite the splendor of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind a frightening vacancy that has no name. Her sarcophagus was decorated with inscriptions. No glyphs on the walls identified her. Was obviously a powerful person, but who was she from the time her tomb was opened? Researchers started attempting to make connections. The strongest hypothesis that the wife of Kinich Janab Pal, popularly known as Pal the Red Queen, was Zakbu Aar. Zakbu Aha, Palink's most well-known monarch, was more than merely Pal's consort. She married into the royal line of Palink and was born into a noble family. She had at least 3 kids at a young age, all of whom were well regarded, and during her husband's rule, she was an important ceremonial figure. If anyone could be buried with such, if it was her, and the fact that the tomb was only a few feet away supported this hypothesis. From Pal's own magnificent funeral at the Temple of the Inscriptions, the closeness points to a intentional pairing of rulers, husband and wife, even in death. And then there's the Cinnabar in Palink. Only 2 tombs with such severe cinnabar were discovered, covering Red Queen and Pal. It's unlikely that this happened by accident, yet here's DNA tests were performed on both sets of remains in order to further unravel the mystery. Hopes of verifying the relationship, however, the findings were unclear. The woman's bones revealed no direct maternal connection to Pal. Nonetheless, this did not preclude a marriage. Given that marriage does not necessitate biological ties, some have suggested she might have been Sakuk Pal's influential mother, who controlled Palink before he reached adulthood. Some speculate that she was a sister, a high priestess, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been erased by the passage of time, yet the proof remains. Most clearly identifies Taku Ao as a queen by title, a mother of kings, and someone who, spiritual equivalent of Pal. The absence of a name might not be an accident. It might have been deliberate. In Maya mythology, the soul survived not by means of monuments but through ceremonial symbols and earthly whispers, and thus the Red Queen stays tethered between myth and reality. A lady in power did not remember, amid stillness and scarlet, but in stone. To comprehend the Red Queen, we must comprehend the environment she came from, which was one in which Maya women, particularly those in royal positions, had greater authority than many. Acknowledge that politics in Maya society was frequently a familial matter, with royal women weren't just submissive partners, they were diplomats, priestesses, and influential people. Brokers, they sponsored temples, performed ceremonies, and were instrumental in preserving dynastic legitimacy through the employment of political capital, their bloodlines. To establish coalitions and protect royal claims, take Sakuk, for instance, the mother of Pal the Great. She assumed authority after Palink's throne became vacant herself and held the position of queen regent until her son reached adulthood. She wasn't a placeholder, she ruled independently, making decisions and supervising. Pal might never have climbed at all without her assistance with construction projects. Was common throughout the Maya realm in locations such as Yakulan Nanjo, and inscriptions from Calakmul depict women conducting important rituals, participating in wartime diplomacy, and occasionally holding positions of authority. Outright, they were frequently shown in murals and paintings, standing next to each other while wearing ornate headpieces and regalia. Kings as equals, or occasionally superiors, their words were inscribed in glyphs. Until centuries later, when Spanish conquistadors arrived, names were remembered. A large portion of that memory has been lost. Native women were viewed as mute by colonists, figures in a society where men predominate, yet archaeology reveals a different tale, with intricate gender roles in which authority was not merely inherited but rather negotiated. The Red Queen may not have ruled in name, but this background gives her a new perspective. However, her burial was lavish and revered, and her placement next to Pal indicates that she was a key pillar of the royal order. Her jade mask served as a symbol of identification rather than only being a decorative piece. Of authority retained in life and shielded in death, her lineage might have been the binding agent of Palenka's dynasty in Maya culture. A queen was more than just a queen. She was a guardian of holy heritage, a ceremonial voice, and frequently serving as a conduit between the gods and humans. The Red Queen may go unnamed, yet in her, the Red Queen was buried in more than just riches. She was buried in a realm in which she was never voiceless. Purpose-driven architecture mixed with ritual symbolism and Maya cosmology. Purposeful design. Her mausoleum served as a portal to more than just a grave. Eternity, one of the lesser pyramids, Temple Third, is where her body was found. Despite being in the center of Palenque, the Temple of the Inscriptions, where Pal the Great is buried, is revealing that the placement of these temples was sacrosanct and they weren't constructed at random. With the help of astrological mythology and dynastic heritage, Temple the Thea climbs modestly in comparison to its magnificent neighbor, but it conceals something even more private, a tightly locked crypt that is flawlessly uncluttered. Maintained, it was built deep within the center of the temple, only reachable via the ascent down the steep, narrow stairs toward her tomb seems almost ritualistic. Downhill into the depths. The room is a bleak, sealed chamber composed of cut stone, tightly for more than 1,130 years, with no murals or glyphs covering the walls and no elaborate. Her narrative is told in the carvings, but maybe the stillness was purposeful. This was a place not for the dead to change, but for the living to understand. Her sarcophagus is at the center. Resembles a limestone altar and reflects the massive stone. Pal's coffin next door, whose lid is renowned for being etched with images of the Red Queen's tomb, is more muted in cosmic rebirth, with an emphasis on the body. On the cinema bar on the actual dying rite, but there are other minor architectural clues that suggest significance. The tomb's east-west alignment, symbolic route that reflects the sun's journey from birth to death. The chamber is little but strong. Maya temples were intentionally constructed as a sacred sanctuary for a person of high regard. Bridges between the earth, the heavens, and the underworld, using cosmological instruments to the Red Queen's eternal abode. To be buried in one meant to transcend the human world. Wasn't a last-minute idea. Rather, it was a meticulously built temple where death became metamorphosis. Her legacy, her essence in cinnabar, and her bones lay in stone. In the structure itself, a temple that communicates with us without using words. Death wasn't the end for the ancient Maya. Rather, it was a threshold. Xibalba is a revered entryway into the underworld, and for the Red Queen this crossing was political, cosmological, and profoundly spiritual. Ritualized funerals were meticulously planned occasions with mythological roots and intended to help the soul navigate the perilous levels of the Maya writings and imagery of the underworld. Inform us that Xibalba was a labyrinth of darkness rather than a tranquil afterlife. Gods of death and rivers of blood trials. Only those who are buried correctly and ritually. The Red Queen was buried wrapped in cinnabar because she was ready and spiritually prepared to begin the voyage. Surrounded by donations and covered in stone, all indications of a dignified funeral. However, there is more. Her grave contains obsidian blades and bone needles. Allude to rites of self-sacrifice that might be symbolic of the liberties she had exercised throughout her life, or that were. Hirari's painstakingly constructed mask was reenacted during her funeral to strengthen her spirit. From jade tiles was more than just ornamental. It might have been a metaphysical container that preserved her face and identity as she entered the afterlife. According to Maya doctrine, the face reflected the soul, and the soul required to be acknowledged by the gods. The pottery pots that round her might have originally contained pulka or chocolate maize water to keep her nourished in the afterlife. Shell trumpets and stingray spines, for example, might have served as spiritual instruments or summons to the gods. Symbols of ceremonial communication. The Maya believed that burial was more than a farewell. It was a metamorphosis. Thought of death as a seed, burial as a planting, and rebirth as the afterlife. Often viewed as earthly manifestations of the gods, kings and queens reverted to those divine forms after they died. Beginnings. The Red Queen, encased in blood, was buried in a pyramid and, honored with sacrifices, was getting ready to reincarnate, not as a mortal, but as a being bound to the universe's sacred order. Her narrative didn't finish with her burial. It marked the start of her mythology. The Red Queen's last burial site is only a short distance away. Kinich Janab Pal's tomb, one of Mesoamerica's most famous, is simply known as Pal the Great's interment within the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions is renowned for its magnitude and artistic quality. Profoundly spiritual symbolism, however, the Red Queen's tomb is remarkable for more reasons than just what was. It was discovered within Temple 3, where her sarcophagus was concealed, near Pal's memorial, in a city like Palenque where all the temples were. This proximity, which was purposefully placed to mirror cosmic principles, was not an accident. Inscription in stone according to several academics, Zakbu Ao Pal's Red Queen. Although there are no inscriptions on her grave, the resemblances between their tombs are impressive. They are both buried in pyramids and draped in cinnabar. These rites reflect each other, with each being buried in jade and receiving great respect. Two as though they were two halves of a sacred story, and Pal's lid notably shows him falling. A cosmic scene of death and rebirth into the underworld treat the Red Queen's more straightforward tomb. Lacks such imagery, yet the combination itself is symbolic. If the Red Queen might have symbolized Pal as the sun traveling into the underworld at night and rising again, symbolized the moon, the feminine energy that travels through the sky on its own enigmatic route. They represented a cosmic duality as monarch and queen, both masculine and feminine. In Maya mythology, the order and ritual of the sun and moon was. It was relational rather than single, and balance was necessary for cosmic harmony. Equilibrium was maintained in the dynastic court by positioning the Red Queen next to Pal. The Maya were maintaining a celestial connection in addition to a marriage. Their closeness may have reflected their positions in life and death, with a queen standing next to. Her king shares a heritage in addition to a throne, and they converse in their tombs without. Phrases two souls bound together in stone and cinnabar for all eternity, one of the most revered silences in history, although time had forgotten her name, the Red. The Queen of Palenque is remembered as one of the most mysterious and strong ladies of the world, not as a forgotten artifact. Ancient globe her grave, which has been shut for more than 1,300 years, now echoes. She is an enigma that continues to elude explanation for generations, raising questions that get louder with each new finding. Complete comprehension. Her name was not carved in glyphs, so we might never know who she was. Steeler recounted her tale, but the attention to detail and depth of her and the meaning of her blood-red bones all allude to a woman who was significant in more ways than one. Spouse or partner, but as a person with genuine spiritual impact and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen challenges our preconceptions. She's a reminder that women participated in rituals and were not mute in the ancient Maya culture, formed dynasties and oversaw cities, while monarchs like Pal have long taken the Red Queen's comeback serves as a reminder that mothers were the conduits for power, not only males. Queens, visionaries, and priestesses, her legacy goes beyond the valuables she left behind. It's the dialogue she initiated between every jade bead, every layer, archaeologists, historians, painters, and storytellers. In cinnabar, each architectural decision in the temple conveys a message. Purposeful. This woman was important, and maybe that's the most remarkable aspect of her narrative. We don't know, but what we still don't know, the Red Queen shows us that history is a living riddle rather than a set of facts. A universal human desire to establish a connection with the past. In that regard, her legacy is. She is still unfolding, wrapped in scarlet, the color of life and blood sacrifice. And resurrection. Her face, which was before concealed by a jade mask, now gazes back at us through science, art, and amazement. She doesn't reveal her identity, but voiceless, enigmatic, and unforgettable, the Red Queen may have once governed a kingdom. However, in death, she governed something more than our wildest dreams. Her grave was sealed with stone. Despite the fact that her story was written in silence, Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the bustling Coyoacán area. Her childhood home, the Casa, was a town on the outskirts of Mexico City. Azul, the blue house, was brimming with subdued power and color contrast. Later on, it would serve as a battlefield, a sanctuary, and a museum dedicated to one of the most famous artists of the 20th century. Guillermo Carlo was a German-Hungarian father who had 4 daughters, Frida being the third. Matilda Calderon, a devoted Catholic of Spanish and indigenous heritage, and photographer. In contrast, Matilda is pious and Guillermo is reserved and intelligent. Frida, who was emotionally distant, would acquire her father's artistic and reflective tendencies. As well as her mother's unwavering fortitude, Frida was creative as a child. Bold and vocal, she read a lot and raised questions that other grown-ups didn't. Wished to respond, but she got polio when she was 6 years old, which left her. She attempted to cover up the physical difference by wearing long skirts, but she was never permitted to. Limit her soul, she spent months in bed and apart from other kids because of the disease, and during this period she developed. Close to her father, who in contrast to most of her peers, urged her to be cognitively active, ride bicycles and exercise. At the time, Frida had no desire to be a wife or a housewife. Instead, she wanted to become a. At the age of 15, the doctor enrolled at Mexico City's esteemed National Preparatory School, one of just a few. Girls were welcomed there, and she distinguished herself not only for her intelligence but also for her. Rebellious with a distinctive sense of style and radical beliefs, she joined a group of young. The Cachuchas were scholars who discussed philosophy, literature, and, in terms of politics, Frida was drawn to views that went against the grain. Even during those formative years before the bus accident that would define her body and before her notoriety, legacy Frida Kahlo was already creating a sharply edged universe for herself. Unrepentant beliefs and a persona too large to fit within anyone else's. Expectations she was getting ready to remake, not just growing up in Coahuila. Completely herself on September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo. Her existence was divided by the lady she had to become and the girl she had been. That afternoon, she boarded a. After school, she rode a wooden bus with her boyfriend Alejandro Gomez Ares. Frida never did anything but laugh, tease, and maybe argue. Halfway through, however, the bus struck a streetcar, and her future suddenly fell apart in agony. Silence and metal. The bus was crushed by a streetcar in a horrifying incident. With passengers flying and timber splintering the wall, Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It went through her pelvis and out of her left hip. Her spinal, her right leg broke, her foot dislocated, and her column was fractured in 3 places. She was just 18 years old when her ribs and collarbone fractured, her shoulder dislocated, and her abdomen was penetrated. Wrapped her in a borrowed overcoat. Another person saw that her body was glistening, but not from blood, but from the gold powder she was carrying in a pouch burst upon contact, showering her fractured body in what appeared to be. Frida, who looked like glittering ash, was brought to the Red Cross hospital and had a number of procedures in the months that followed, and she was flat on her body for weeks. Back immobile, writhing in confusion and sickness, the future she had envisioned. With each day that went by, becoming a doctor became more distant, but in that, when there was silence, something started to move. Her father gave her brushes, and her mother installed a mirror on the canopy so she could see herself, and she set up a customized easel to hang above her bed. Frida started painting with plaster and pain, initially out of boredom and later out of preoccupation since she was all she had. Her first subjects were her own reflections. However, what came out wasn't vanity. Was surviving the collision had opened a door for her, but it had also physically broken her. A portal to her own body and psyche, and ultimately to the weird language of suffering and identity that would characterize her work, the young woman who aspired to cure others. As Frida Kahlo lay there, she started to mend herself one brushstroke at a time. Clad in steel and plaster, a body struggling to breathe, she started painting what initially appeared to be a type of therapy quickly developed into a language, and that language was extremely intimate, brutally honest, and frequently difficult to see. Was the exact reason why Frida depicted her suffering rather as lovely flowers or courteous landscapes. Her initial subjects were existential, emotional, and physical. Not because she was conceited, but rather because, as she memorably stated, I paint myself since I am the topic I know, and because I am frequently by myself. Her earliest pieces were small-scale paintings on wood or tin panels, influenced by religious paintings of Mexican retos that depict tales of agony and miracles. Frida transformed this custom inward, using her body as a canvas. Emotions turned into the altar, and she depicted herself as broken and pierced as blood. Like a contemporary martyr, she is impaled by nails in one painting. In another, she, floating in a desolate area while attached to a damaged column, which serves as a metaphor for her. She portrayed herself with a broken spine, crying, nude, and decapitated. However, she never stopped observing her suffering, she painted the. Each painting combined the ugly aspects of trauma with beauty, rebellion, and even humor. Recovery of her body, her life, and her identity as a woman in a system that frequently attempted to characterize her. But Frida wasn't merely narrating her story, she was creating a novel form of visual storytelling that combined medical illustration, surrealism, Mexican folk art, and symbolism in a milieu of color culture. Her paintings turned into dreamy autopsies of her soul. Myth by the time Frida was well enough to walk once more, albeit in agony, she was no. For a while, the girl who had aspired to become a doctor was an artist, and her work was unique. Frida Kahlo did more than just paint. She used the worst thing that had ever occurred to her as a catalyst for her creativity. She transformed misery into a reality by forcing the world to see her suffering, become a revered form of self-expression while still recuperating in 1928. At the age of 21, Frida Kahlo was still painting when she met the guy who would become Diego Rivera. He was in the most intense and tumultuous relationship of her life. Was nearly 20 years older than her, and massive, the most well-known painter in Mexico was. Rivera was a titan of Mexican mural art, renowned for his size and presence. Frida had already seen his work, which featured broad, politically charged frescoes that portrayed the tale of the Mexican people. She liked it, but now she wanted to know what he thought of her work. At the Ministry of Education, she interrupted his scaffold work to show him her paintings and asked directly, "Do I possess talent?" Diego said after glancing at it. "Yes, and not just because. Friendliness." He heard something uncommon in her, a raw, unadulterated voice, and modest, full of anger, irony, anguish, and beauty. They started dating. That was both creative and consuming. Frida once remarked, "I suffered too. One of my life's mishaps involved being knocked down by a streetcar, and the other involved Diego." They were married in 1929, which was a strange coupling with outsiders. Diego, a hugely unfaithful, well-known politician. Frida. Her parents are sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, and already need a cane to walk. Compared it like the union of an elephant and a dove. Their relationship was intense, but although Diego encouraged her to pursue her painting career and supported her artistic endeavors, yet he was also frequent infidelity, including with Frida's own sister Cristina, left Frida heartbroken and in. She returned with her own partners, including alleged liaisons, both men and women. Georgia O'Keeffe, a painter, and Leon Trotsky got divorced in 1939, remarried a year later on different conditions, allowing Frida to maintain her independence. Their second marriage was less about conventional love. She kept her name, her home, and her money, and more about cooperative creativity and understanding in spite of the treachery. And Diego was a persistent influence in Frida's life despite the pain. He pushed her. Although he injured her, he also saw her as a rebel, an artist, and as a woman who had the ability to reinterpret what painting may be. Although they were not at peace, they were renowned in the 1930s, Frida Kahlo traveled north to San Francisco with Diego Rivera. He produced well-known mural commissions in Detroit and New York. Years spent overseas exposed her to the wealth and complexities of American industrialism. They caused her great political unease. Frida was a patriotic Mexican, admirer of local customs, a fervent communist, and a nationalist, the luxury she saw in the U.S., particularly during the Great Depression that devastated much of the nation, further strengthened her sense of disappointment. She critiqued the culture's consumerism and fixation on. She missed Mexico's contrast, grit, and color, while Frida started painting smaller, more subdued murals after creating massive murals on the walls of the factory. Creates extremely intimate paintings on canvas, and her style became distinct and very personal and passionate at this period. She created some. Frida painted herself for more than just vanity in one of her most famous self-portraits. Her identity turned into her landscape in order to exist, and her body was always in. She withdrew inward after suffering from an injury that required several operations and a failed pregnancy in Detroit. Her portraits revealed her gushing in pieces, but her expression remained composed at all times. Henry Ford Hospital displays one of her most potent pieces, which is straightforward and unreserved. Sobbing while resting on a hospital bed with floating reminders of loss all around. Raw, gory images of a fetus, a snail, medical equipment, and a fractured pelvis. Intensely poignant, a canvas dripping with reality back in Mexico, Frida. Involved in left-wing politics when Leon Trotsky was living in exile, she and Diego invited him to stay at their house. Frida donned. Tijuana wears traditional indigenous clothing as a fashion statement as much as a political and cultural statement. Her body, identity, and values were always intertwined with her art, and her beliefs were all included into her artwork. As Rivera painted murals of, Frida portrayed the human cost of the revolution, the body in ruins, the mind on fire, and the self constantly looking back. During her illness and exile, she evolved into more than just a tale of suffering, but also one of defiance. When Frida Kahlo came back to, she was more than just Diego Rivera's wife in Mexico in the late 1930s. She had transformed into a force and an artist whose creations glowed with unadulterated sincerity, fantastical symbolism, and cultural identity in her native country. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacán became a haven of color as she fully embraced herself. And contradiction, Aztec monuments in the garden, monkeys with bright cobalt walls and yellow trim, and free-roaming parrots. The house was a live manifestation of Frida's fantasy, combining tradition with. She surrounded herself with earth, elegance, and defiance. Exodo's folk art, revolutionary texts, and pre-Columbian relics. She wore bold Tijuana paints and arranges flowers in her hair while listening to mariachi music and the aroma of copal incense. The street outside during this time, there was a creative explosion. Her paintings, such as the two Fridas, become increasingly complex, allegorical, and political, showed a split personality, one wearing a European outfit and a bleeding heart, the other in. Frida's visual autobiography was a powerful and structured example of indigenous dress. Portrait of ancestry and love loss, she displayed her paintings in Paris in 1939, where her passionately original work was lauded by artists like as Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky. But Frida stood out even among the surrealists. When André Breton, "They thought I was a surrealist," she retorted, despite their attempts to categorize her as one of their own. She did not depict the romantic Mexico. Instead, she depicted my own reality. Postcard representation, not the actual nation she loved her job in. Full of symbolism, including skeletons, hummingbirds, corn, thorns, and blood. She revealed the bloodshed of her country's past and today while paying respect to its indigenous traditions. Yet, her health kept deteriorating even as her creative voice became more powerful. She painted through the everyday realities of infections, surgery, and chronic agony. Frida was propped up in bed with her fingers clasped on the brush and her chest bound in corsets. Had gone back to Mexico to use paint to regain her authority rather than to relax. Through politics and her unafraid self-acceptance, as Frida Kahlo's body grew older in the 1940s, kept deceiving her. Her right leg was weakening, her spine was persistently infected. She had over 30 surgeries during her lifespan, frequently. In a torturous succession, she was occasionally bedridden for months wearing body casts or, despite being immobilized by traction devices that caused her bones to separate, she painted during these years. Every canvas served both a release and an act of resistance. She painted with clarity, and her pieces became darker and more defiant. Sharpened by suffering, she refused to conceal herself in metaphor. In the broken column, displays herself with a fractured ionic column in place of her body pierced with claws and divided down the middle. Spine, but her expression is stern and her eyes are immovable. Frida's pain was no longer only a topic, it was her friend, her foe, her inspiration, and her political voice. Additionally, she became more vocal, marched in protests, sent venomous letters, and joined the Mexican Communist Party. Denounced injustice and imperialism when her health prevented her from walking, she showed up at wheelchair protesters holding signs and yelling slogans in defiance. It was long delayed that Frida received her first solo exhibition in Mexico in 1953, celebration of her art, but because of her weakened health, physicians advised her to couldn't go, so she arrived by ambulance like only Frida would, put on her hospital bed in the middle of the gallery after being carried in on a stretcher while wearing traditional. With her own artwork surrounding her, she welcomed guests with tequila laughing and bright flame remained in her eyes. Her last drawings were both innocent and terrifying. In Marxism Will Heal the Ailing, she depicted herself in the hands of Marx holding a steel corset, removing the emblems of a Oppression, a still life of sliced watermelons with the inscription Viva la Vida on one piece, was her final known creation. Long live life. Despite dying, she remained joyous and rebellious. The final portraits by political artist Frida Kahlo were not merely self-portraits. They were painfully painted acts of revolution. Consistently signed with life on July 13, 1954, when he was 47 years old. La Casa Azul in Coyoacán, where Frida Kahlo was born, is where she passed away. Although a pulmonary embolism was reported as the official cause, her closest friends and family suspected something more serious. Had been sick, undoubtedly, but also worn out from the agony of the surgeries and the protracted conflict with. Days prior, she had participated in a political demonstration opposing the CIA coup. Despite being weak and confined to a wheelchair in Guatemala, she insisted on using her clenched fist. Her last diary note was brief, and revolution remained her last heartbeat, elevated in the air. But piercing, I hope the departure is happy and that I never have to. Return. The Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most revered venue, hosted Frida's funeral. Renowned cultural organization, her body, covered in the Mexican Communist Party's red flag, was protected by family, friends, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was devastated and referred to her as his true love despite his betrayals. Had almost destroyed her, yet something remarkable occurred to Frida Kahlo in the years after her death. Refused to go away. Initially, only in art circles was her name mentioned. Her artwork were difficult to classify since they were too surreal for traditionalists and too political for surrealists. However, her tale, image, and defiance gradually started to. Noted as feminist academics and activists during the 1970s and 1980s. Frida's regained, buried words grew stronger. She was more than just a painter. She was once a representation of suffering transformed into the beauty of feminism, which was born via. Mexican identity struggle is celebrated without apologies for being gay. Her face's unibrow gazing and the disability revolution. Her house became a museum, her diary became a landmark, and the flowers on her hair became legendary. The greatest museums in the world now display Frida Kahlo's paintings and spiritual texts. Her life in Diego's shadow, but she came forward in death. She didn't only. Leaving paintings behind, she challenged us all to gaze in the mirror she left behind. Pity, not with fear, but with fire, Frida Kahlo's face is printed all over today. Transformed into toys, memes, posters, and emblems on t-shirts painted on murals. Characteristic unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, and her immediate stare. Her legacy is important not only because people recognize her face, but also because they understand the truth. In reality, Frida didn't strive for perfection, didn't conform to social norms, and didn't wish to live in a society that expects perfection. She gave us authenticity, which was paradoxical and raw, messy, vivid, angry, and joyous. She embraced her uniqueness, including her disabilities and queerness. Her politics, culture, and art transcended national boundaries. Over the years, she has evolved into a global icon of rebellion in addition to being an artist. For queer groups, she is a symbol of feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. An emblem of brazen bisexuality, who lived freely and unrepentantly during a period that commanded quiet. She serves as a message to women that having power doesn't have to. Permission for artists with disabilities. She is evidence that suffering may inspire the artist to stop it. She is a strong, reclaimed daughter who will always be a part of Mexico. Her paintings were initially disregarded as being too odd or too. Nowadays, personal works like the two Fridas are among the most admired in the world. Anyone can relate to the self-portrait with the thorn necklace, hummingbird, and shattered column on a deep level. Who has ever had to transform their sorrow into something sacred? Lived on the periphery and elevated them to the forefront. She welcomed contradiction, a communist wearing gold. A broken body with an indestructible soul. A woman betrayed who fell in love again. And throughout everything, she painted not only with hues but also with conviction. Frida Kahlo just spoke the truth about her beliefs without ever asking to be a symbol. Herself, revealing the reality to millions of people who had never previously seen themselves represented in art. Now, when we look at her face, we see bravery, color, and resistance. We regard Frida as immortal rather than dead.